The planet ate ships the way a throat swallows. Raoul had read the survey reports. He had read them the way you read accounts of executions with the clinical detachment of someone who believes, at a cellular level, that the thing described will never happen to them. Vethkara. Class 9. Hostile atmospheric shear events classified as semi-predatory. Canyon acid bloom density, exceeding survivability thresholds for 93% of cataloged species. He had read all of it, and then he had filed the flight plan anyway, because the mineral signatures in the deep cradle were unlike anything in the hegemony database. And Raoul Endymion had never once in his 37 years been able to leave an unknown thing alone. The sheer hit without warning. Not from behind, from everywhere, simultaneously. As though the sky had decided all at once to become a fist. The survey vessel Litotes shuddered along her entire spine. And then the spine broke. And then Raoul was experiencing several things at once. The scream of metal giving way. The particular vertiginous quality of freefall that no amount of training ever fully domesticates. And the strange calm that settles over certain minds in the moment before impact. A calm that feels less like acceptance and more like the brain finally running fast enough to see every option at once. He hit the emergency harness release and dropped into the crash cradle 4 seconds before the Litotes met the canyon floor. The impact was a sound that lived below sound, a pressure event that he felt in his sternum, in his back teeth, in the roots of his eyes. Then silence, except for the ticking of cooling metal and the distant, patient sound of Vethkara's wind moving through the canyon above. He catalogued his body. Left shoulder wrong, dislocated. The joint sitting in the wrong geometry. The pain a hot wire running from the socket to his jaw. Scalp open above the left ear. Blood already sheeting down the side of his face in a way that felt faster than it probably was. Ribs intact. Vision clear. He took this inventory the way a craftsman takes inventory after a flood, not lamenting the damage, but establishing the actual conditions of the workspace. The Litotes had come down in the cradle proper. Through the cracked viewport, he could see the canyon walls rising on 3 sides, dark stone threaded with veins of something bioluminescent, pulsing a deep arterial blue. The floor was wrong. Not flat. Covered in low structures that he initially took for rock formations before he noticed their symmetry. The acid blooms, dormant in what passed for daylight on this world. Their petals folded, closed, like fists. They would open with the dark. He had approximately 6 hours. He did not waste a single one of them, feeling afraid. The first thing he did was find a specific angle of canyon wall, a jutting limestone shelf at shoulder height, and he positioned himself with care. Located the joint by feel rather than sight. Breathed out completely, and drove his shoulder into the rock. The sound it made belonged to a different category than sound. The pain was a white event, total and absolute, occupying every inch of his nervous system for 4 full seconds. Then it receded, and the joint was back where it belonged, and he tested it rotation, extension, load-bearing, and nodded once. He did not see the observer until he turned around. It was clinging to the canyon wall 12 meters above him, 6-limbed, each limb ending in adhesion pads that gripped the stone with the casual certainty of something that had never once worried about falling. Its body was armored in overlapping plates, the color of old bone, and its eyes compound, enormous. Occupying most of what might have been called its face, were processing him with an attention that felt less like curiosity and more like documentation. A data collection event. A thing. Being filed. He stared at it. It stared at him, with 17 spectrums of vision, simultaneously. Observer, he said, the Drosul translator, chip in his jaw, rendered it passably. I'm going to need some of your light. The creature did not respond immediately. When it did, the voice came through the chip as something between a creak and a chord, rendered into words that arrived with a faint delay, as though the translation itself was uncertain. You are designated Raoul Endymion. Survey class. You have crashed on a class. 9 hostile. You are injured. The collective's assessment is that you will not survive the first rotation. The collective's assessment, Raoul said, already moving toward the wreckage of the litotes, is working with incomplete data. He went into the broken ship and began to take it apart. Not randomly. With the focused intention of someone who has already decided, without drama, what needs to happen next. He pulled the thermal insulation from the bulkheads in long strips. He located the emergency shelter kit compressed, but functional. The mylar sheets, capable of reflecting body heat back, with roughly 70% efficiency. He found the medical kit and treated the scalp wound with 7 precise strips of skin tape, working by feel with the small mirror from the kit, rather than by sight. And then he found the remaining food stores and counted them, and made 3 decisions about rations that he did not agonize over. Above him, Siv Orath, Senior Observer, Drasul Collective, stationed on Vethkara for 212 Terran years, transmitted his amended assessment. Extend observation window. He had not filed that amendment in 212 years. The human was not surviving despite his damage. He was incorporating it. The dislocated shoulder had become, in the span of 4 minutes, a data point rather than a determining factor. Siv Orath's analytical arrays searched for the correct taxonomic category and returned nothing. The closest they could offer was the Drasul concept of Karev Hal, a being in correct relationship with necessity. But Karev Hal was achieved through years of philosophical training. The human had arrived at it by setting his own shoulder against a rock. Night fell on Vethkara. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in the span of an hour. The acid blooms opened slowly, each petal unfolding with a sound like paper tearing in slow motion, releasing a pale phosphorescent gas that pooled at ankle height and glowed the color of a dying star. In the blue light, the canyon was extraordinary. It was the most lethal environment in the contested fringe, and it was extraordinary, and Raoul Endymion stood at the edge of his makeshift camp and looked at it for a long moment before he turned back to work. Then the shadows began to move. Siv Orath had mapped 3,000 years of Vethkara's kill patterns, and still could not explain what the human was doing with the shadows. The Vreth came with the full dark not immediately but with the patience of ambush hunters who had never once needed to hurry. They moved in the narrow band between the acid bloom pools and the canyon walls, following thermal signatures with the single-minded precision of organs that had evolved for exactly this purpose. They were blind. They had no eyes, no ears, no olfactory capacity. They navigated entirely through a thermal sense so refined it could detect the heat differential between a living body and the stone beside it at 40 meters. Siv Orath activated his thermal null field and became, to the Vreth, nothing. The field cost 3% of his reserve power per hour. It was, by Drasul standards, a trivial expense. He had used it on Vethkara for 2 centuries without once considering what it meant to exist without it. He watched the human. Raoul had found a position on a slight rise at the center of the crash site, and was, as far as Siv Orath could determine, watching the Vreth move, not fleeing them, watching them. For 20 minutes, Siv Orath counted, he tracked their sweep patterns without moving. His body heat a beacon that should have drawn them immediately, except that his body was wrapped in the thermal mylar from the shelter kit, and the heat signature he projected was diffuse, scattered, insufficient for a clean lock. A temporary measure. The Vreth would triangulate eventually. 20 minutes. Siv Orath calculated the human's remaining margin at between 7 and 11 minutes. He filed the calculation and continued observing. Then Raoul moved, not away from the Vreth, toward the wreckage. He extracted 3 sections of the Litotes engine housing, still warm from the crash, radiating heat in the 8 to 12 degree range that the Vreth preferred, and he placed them in a pattern that Siv Orath's analytical arrays took 4 seconds to parse. A triangle. 3 heat sources arranged to create a false body signature in the geometric center of the crash site, approximately 6 meters from where Raoul then pressed himself against the canyon wall, thermally invisible beneath the mylar, and waited. The first Vreth reached the decoy in 3 minutes. The second, drawn by the movement of the first, arrived from a different vector. They met at the center of the triangle, two ambush hunters whose prey had positioned them to collide with each other. And the resulting territorial engagement was brief, brutal, and entirely definitive. When it was done, neither Vreth was hunting anything. Siv Orath's analytical arrays flagged the recording as a potential error and ran 3 verification passes before accepting it as accurate data. He descended from the wall. He had not spoken since his initial assessment. Protocol required silence during observation. He broke protocol because something in the 212 years of filing accurate data could not absorb what he had just watched without response. "What you have done," he transmitted, touching down on the canyon floor 12 meters from the human, "is without merit." Raoul looked at him. The blood on his face had dried to a dark, rust color. He looked like something that had fought the planet and decided to keep going. "I'm alive," he said. "That seems like merit. You deceived the predators. You used tools. You did not demonstrate adaptation. You demonstrated manipulation. The Drasul have maintained the doctrine of Vethkara for 3 millennia. This world is a teacher. Species that survive through legitimate adaptation earn passage. Species that circumvent the lesson learn nothing. You have learned nothing." There was a silence. The acid blooms pulsed around them in the dark, phosphorescent and patient. "Every tool I've ever used was a trick," Raoul said. His voice was even, not defensive considering, the way someone considers a position they've already thought past. "Fire was a trick. The wheel was a trick. Language is a trick. We play on entropy, taking randomness, and making it mean something. You're calling me unworthy for doing the thing that makes us human." He paused. "Your doctrine assumes survival has a correct method. I don't think the universe cares about method. I think the universe cares about outcomes. The outcome of your method," Siv-Orath said, "is that you have learned nothing about the Vreth. You have evaded them. You do not understand them." Raoul was quiet for a moment. Then something happened in his face that Siv-Orath's emotional taxonomy had no category for. It was not quite amusement, and not quite challenge, and not quite hunger. It was the expression of someone who has just found a door they hadn't expected. "Then, stop treating this as a test," Raoul said, "and teach me. Show me their actual weakness." Siv-Orath understood, in the 2 seconds before he replied, that he was going to do it. He was going to show the human. He did not fully understand why protocol forbade assistance, doctrine forbade engagement, and 2 centuries of careful observation forbade the kind of direct contact that changed the thing being observed. But the human was looking at Vethkara the way the Drasul had not looked at it in 3,000 years, not as a gauntlet, as a conversation partner. And something in Siv-Orath, old and tired of accurate data filed into archives that changed nothing, needed to see where that conversation went. He showed him, and in the 20 minutes that followed, as Raoul absorbed the information with an attention that was almost reverent, Siv-Orath understood with growing certainty that he had made a significant mistake and that he was not going to correct it. By the 3rd rotation, the planet had stopped killing him and started watching. Raoul had not slept in 61 hours. He had eaten twice small, calculated meals from the Litotsi's emergency stores, sufficient for function rather than comfort. His shoulder ached with a persistent, specific quality. The kind of pain that becomes a known geography rather than a crisis. The scalp wound was clean. The mylar shelter had held. He had moved his camp twice, once because a bloom cluster shifted position in the night, once because he'd found a better vantage point above the canyon's central channel. He had, in the 2 days since his conversation with Siv-Orath, done something that had no precedent in 3,000 years of Drasul documentation on Vethkara. He had mapped the cradle. Not with instruments, most of the Litotes sensors were scrap. He had mapped it the way early humans had mapped unknown coastlines, which is to say through presence, attention, and the particular human gift for finding patterns in systems that appear to have none. He knew where the Vreth colonies bedded during the acid peak hours. He knew the 6 bloom clusters that vented gas in sequence rather than simultaneously, creating a corridor of breathable air during the worst of the night. He knew the thermal updraft from the canyon's eastern face that created a warm pocket, 60 meters up, inaccessible to him, but visible. And visible things have uses. He knew the sound the wind made 3 minutes before the shear events, a specific harmonic that no instrument had ever been calibrated to catch, because no instrument had survived long enough to learn it. He knew Vethkara the way you know a difficult person after years of close attention. Not controlled, not mastered, known. Sivorath transmitted none of this. He had transmitted nothing for 40 hours. The collective had filed 2 queries requesting status updates on the human, and had received, from their senior observer of 212 years, complete silence. The extraction team arrived at dawn on the 3rd rotation. There were 7 of them. Drasul combat designates larger than Sivorath. Their armor plates reinforced with impact polymers, each carrying the tools of a species that had spent 3,000 years studying Vethkara's kill patterns and learning to move through them cleanly. Thermal, null, fields, active. They descended the canyon wall in precise formation. And Sivorath, watching from the eastern ridge, understood immediately what they were. He had filed too much. The silence itself was data. The collective had read the observation logs, the extended window, the amended assessments, the absence of the final death report that 3,000 years said should have arrived on the 1st rotation, and had drawn the correct conclusion. A human surviving Vethkara, invalidated doctrine. Doctrine was the collective's architecture. The collective could not permit the data to exist. He dropped to the canyon floor in 4 seconds. Raoul was already awake, crouched at the edge of the camp, watching the extraction team descend. "They're not here for a rescue," Raoul said. It was not a question. "No," Sivorath said. He felt the weight of what he was about to do, the rank, the standing, the 212 years of careful observation about to be filed under something the collective's taxonomy would call betrayal. The word for it in Drasul was simpler. A truth they had no category for, demanding a response they had no protocol for. They will attempt to sterilize the site. Raoul nodded. He was already moving not away from the team but toward the canyon's central channel, the long slot of stone that Sivorath had watched him study for 2 days without understanding why. "I need 11 minutes, he said. "Can you keep them talking for 11 minutes? I am a senior observer. I have no authority over combat designates. Can you keep them talking?" Sivorath considered the question honestly. 6 minutes, he said. "Perhaps 7. That's enough." What happened in the next 40 minutes was not, strictly speaking, a battle. Battles have 2 forces in opposition. What happened in the cradle of Vethkara, on the 3rd rotation of Raoul and Dimian's survival, was something closer to a translation event. A human who had spent 61 hours learning the language of a lethal world, speaking it back, fluently, at the people who had come to kill him. Sivorath held the extraction team for 8 minutes through a combination of procedural challenges, documentation requests, and the specific authority that 2 centuries of seniority confers, even on a disgraced observer. Then, the lead combat designate moved past him, and the team spread into the canyon. They never found Raoul. They found, instead, Vethkara redirected, repurposed, applied with the patience of a man who had had 2 days to learn exactly where everything was. The first 2 designates entered the eastern corridor during a bloom vent sequence that Raoul had triggered early by heating a metal panel in the corridor's thermal pathway. Something Sivorath would spend years afterward, trying to fully reconstruct in his records. The gas was not lethal to Drasul, but the bioluminescent bloom material that coated the corridor floor in the vent's wake was a contact irritant that rendered their thermal null fields inert. 2 designates, suddenly visible to the Vreth, were escorted out of the canyon by the planet's own security system with an efficiency that Vethkara's designers, if it had designers, would have found deeply satisfying. The next three encountered the Vreth colony. Raoul had spent 2 days carefully not disturbing, and then, with the extraction team's approach, had quietly, systematically irritated into a defensive state. The resulting encounter was brief. The final 2 designates found Raoul. He was in the canyon's central channel. Remember, the slot of stone that Siv Orath now understood he had chosen, because it was the one place in the cradle where the acid bloom's gas vented upward rather than pooling breathable, defensible, and positioned above the main thermal updraft that created a warm corridor no Vreth would enter. He was standing in it, with the wreckage of a panel from the litotes held loosely in his right hand, the dislocated shoulder's arm, and he looked at the 2 combat designates the way someone looks at a problem they have already solved. The fight was short. Raoul was not a soldier, he was a survey specialist with 37 years of working in environments that wanted him dead, which is a different kind of training entirely, and, in the specific context of the cradle, a more useful one. He knew where the footing was wrong. He knew where the blooms vented without warning. He knew the sound the wind made 3 minutes before the shear events. When it was done, he sat down on the canyon floor and breathed. Siv Orath found him there. The observer stood at the entrance to the channel and processed what the recording arrays were capturing. And for the first time in 212 years, he did not immediately begin composing the formal transmission. He stood in the canyon of a world that had killed 11 species in documented history and looked at the human sitting in its throat. And he filed nothing, because he had not yet found the language. "You should have left," Siv Orath said finally. "When you defeated the first Vreth sweep, you could have climbed the western face. The rock is climbable. I watched you identify the route." "I know," Raoul said. "Why didn't you?" Raoul was quiet for a moment. The acid blooms pulsed around them, phosphorescent in the canyon's perpetual half-dark, their gas thinning in the updraft, their light making the canyon walls glow in a way that had nothing to do with what the canyon was, and everything to do with what it was made of. "I told you I'd reach the far ridge before I left," he said. Siv Orath processed this. "You made that statement to motivate me to share information." "It was a tactical statement." "It was both," Raoul said. "That's not the same as it being only one." He stood up. He tested the shoulder. He looked at the canyon for a moment. The blooms, the bioluminescent veins in the stone, the shadows of the Vreth, receding toward their daytime colonies, the distant sound of the wind above the canyon's rim, and then he began to climb. Siv Orath transmitted to the collective for the first time in 40 hours. The transmission was not long. It was the most significant document he had filed in 2 centuries, and it contained fewer words than most of his daily atmospheric reports. Recommend reclassification. Vethkara is no longer the apex predator in the cradle. The far ridge took Raoul 40 minutes to reach. His shoulder complained throughout, a specific and honest pain that he acknowledged and did not negotiate with. The rock was cold under his hands and then warm where the morning light caught it, and then cold again in the shadowed sections. And he noted the transitions, without making them mean more than they were. He pulled himself onto the ridge as the sun, Vethkara's sun, smaller and cooler than Sol, throwing a light that was more amber than gold, cleared the canyon's eastern wall and hit the cradle fully for the first time in 3 days. Below him, the blooms were closing, their petals folding back into fists as the temperature rose. The Vreth were gone. The canyon floor was empty, except for the wreckage of the litotes, broken and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have been used completely. He stood on the ridge for a moment and felt, with a clarity that surprised him, that the canyon was extraordinary, not in spite of everything it had tried to do to him, including it. The lethality was part of the extraordinary. The beauty and the danger were the same feature, and he was standing on a ridge, looking at 3 days of the most vivid experience of his life, and the calculation part of his mind was quiet for the first time since the sheer hit. He stayed another hour just to look at it. Below, in the canyon, Orath, stripped of rank, stripped of standing in the collective, facing a formal inquiry that would consume years of his remaining service, sat against the canyon wall, with his recording arrays still running, and filed the observation as the only honest thing he had written in a long career of accurate data. The human had reached the far ridge. The human had then remained on the far ridge for reasons that had nothing to do with survival. The human was looking at a canyon that had tried to kill him 3 times in 3 days and finding it, by every behavioral indicator available to Drasul analysis, beautiful. Orath did not have a category for this. He had 212 years of data and 17 spectrums of vision and the most sophisticated analytical arrays the collective had ever deployed in the field, and he did not have a single word for what a species was called when it looked at the thing that had tried to destroy it and stayed an extra hour because the light was good. He filed it anyway. He filed it as the most scientifically inexplicable observation of his career. And he marked it, for the first time, not as data, but as testimony. The sun climbed. The blooms slept. On the far ridge, Raoul and Endymion looked out at Vethkara, and the universe continued, vast and changed, and full of beauty that would not kill him today.